Let's take a little time and look at my old school Excaliber monster truck build. I started this build in 2014 when the old school monster truck scene started to take shape. I started by gathering some RC4WD drive axles, RC4WD drive shocks, and a Tamiya cloudbuster body. And the idea was to build a cool old school monster truck, not exactly a replica of anything in particular. I started the build and was on a good path until I wrote an article on a really cool Excaliber monster truck, and that inspired me to build my own version. But I decided to take mine in a different direction. I went with the first version of the truck instead of the black one that most people think of. The goal with the build was to make a truck as scale as possible, but not necessarily an exact replica. I'm considering this to be more of a tribute build. I was able to find great photos of the chassis and managed to get some detailed drawings of some sections from my buddy Dan Wyatt. The combination of the two allowed me to design the chassis assembly that you see here. The main frame rails are pretty complicated, so I had a local machine shop make those, and while they were at it, I had them cut the aluminum plate on their water jet machine to speed things up. I combined a bunch of aluminum parts with some 3D printed parts that look like some of the welded plates on the full-size chassis, and it looks pretty close to the real deal to me. The springs for the truck came from Tamiya and or RC4WD drive. I can't exactly remember where I got them from. I wanted the leaf spring pack to look as beefy as possible, so I stacked 2 of every leaf when assembling them to make things a little bit thicker. The springs are bolted to some custom 3D printed mounts that are screwed to the axles, and some extra 3D printed parts enhance the look of the assembly with nuts and so on. My original plan was to use a bunch of scale shocks from RC4WD drive, but once they arrived, I quickly found that they were just too big to look right on the truck, so I had to come up with a plan B. That ended up being a complete set of 3D printed shocks that are mainly there for looks. Just like the real trucks from the 80s, the suspension on this truck doesn't really move, so there's no need for functional dampers. The front and rear of the truck uses RC4WD drive Blackwell axles to enhance the scale look and to give it four-wheel steering. The axles for sure are not built for this type of work, and I don't expect them to hold up to any abuse. I plan on taking it easy with this truck, and if the axles actually do end up breaking, it'll be a dedicated shelf truck. I picked up a set of JConcepts Firestorm tires for this build because to me they look pretty close to what was used on the full-size truck. I paired them with Tamiya cloudbuster wheels that have been modified to look more scale. The real truck used big rig drum brakes with 10 lugs and bolts to hold them in place, so I replicated that. Now on this truck, 10 small nuts keep the wheel in place instead of a single nut. The tire and wheel combo on this truck is what made me switch up the version of the truck that I decided to build. A lot of people use the Tamiya cloudbuster body to make the black version, but in my opinion the JConcepts tires are just too large for the size of that body, and that's why I went with one from RC4WD drive. The RC4WD drive body is larger and has a similar look as the gray version of Excaliber. The only problem is that I needed a truck body, and RC4WD drive only had a Blazer body. So that's what I started with, and I've made a ton of modifications to get it to the point where it is today, and a lot more are on the way. The front end of the RC4WD drive Blazer is tilted at the bottom, so I had to cut it up and straighten that out. Then I designed a 3D printed grille that looks more like the one used on the full-size truck. The last thing I did was glue the hood in place, cut the front end off the body so it could be hinged and tilted to expose the engine. I cut the bed off the cab and designed a 3D printed piece that caps the back of it off. A little bit of sanding and some scratch filler primer was used to get that surface perfectly smooth. Now I wanted the truck to have a full interior and I wanted it to be easily seen, so I cut the doors out of the cab and hinged them, and I've been spending a lot of time making sure that the doors fit just right. I even took the time to modify the top of the doors. They're usually kind of curved at the top and they're really thin. I didn't like how they looked, so I cut up the door and the top of the cab and I made them look a little bit more flat, which to me gives it a much better look in the end. Magnets keep the doors closed when the truck will be driving, and I still have to make a firewall and design and make the entire interior. The bed had to be extended to give it the right look, and that was all done with sheet plastic that I formed and glued in place. I ended up making the bed a little bit too long, so I'm going to have to cut it up and make that change before I mount it to the chassis. I made my own floor for the bed because the one that came in the Blazer body wouldn't have matched the new section when I was done, and a new floor solves that problem. The bed is where I'm going to hide a lot of electronics. The full-size truck had a massive fuel tank in the bed along with a hydraulic tank, so I designed some 3D printed pieces that replicate that. The fuel tank will cover a small light bulb that I'll be using to power the truck, and the hydraulic tank will be used to hide the speed control and the receiver. I also designed a roll bar, light buckets, and a couple other things to make it look like the real deal. An engine from RC4WD Drive keeps up with the scale appearance of the build. It houses the truck's electric motor, and the transmission behind it will turn a custom transfer case. Unfortunately, this is a small block Chevy, and the full-size truck had a big block, so I have to make some modifications to the engine to give it more of a scale appearance. The version of the truck that I'm replicating had a standard intake with a carburetor and an air cleaner, but I want this to have a blower assembly. So I designed that, and although some of the parts and pieces are already made, I want to add more detail. So I'll be making some tweaks to the design and redoing that before I attach everything to the engine. I barely scratched the surface of what I've done to this truck so far, and I'll give you more information on the build when it's done. This is a project that I only want to work on when I'm into it because I want to do the best job possible. So it might be a little while before you see the completed build.